Recording has been started.
Good morning, everyone in United States, and good evening to our distinguished guest in Australia. On the CSA platform, on third episode of Strategically Speaking with Dr. Adityanjee, we have a distinguished academic and sociologist, Professor Salvatore Babones. Professor Babones does not need any introduction from me, but for sake of our viewers, I'll say a few words. He's a quantitative comparative sociologist who studies international relations in a statistical framework. He's a US citizen who is teaching at University of Sydney. He's associate professor of sociology there. His research focus is currently on Indo-Pacific. He has written 14 books. He has widely written articles in peer-reviewed journals. He teaches master's and PhD level students in University of Australia. And I'm very proud to say that he has a keen interest in India as a sociologist and has also followed the political economy of India over a period of time. So welcome, Professor Babones on CSA platform. Thank you for being able to find some time. The topic for discussion today is India-US relationship. As everyone knows, Prime Minister Modi visited United States, capital Washington, D.C. in June of 2023. It was a very successful visit. The joint communique that was issued from White House and Ministry of External Affairs had 58 points. And I must say, following India-US relationship since 1947, we've come a long way. We have come a long way from mid-50s when John Foster Dulles declared that neutrality is immoral. If you are not with us, you are against us. You were being pigeonholed into boxes at that point in time. So we'll invite our distinguished guest to opine on the current status of India-US relationship. And as a framework, since he's a comparative quantitative sociologist, for this conversation, we'll use a SWOT analysis model: strength, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So Salvatore, welcome to CSA. And let's start with what are the strengths in the US-India relationships at this time. Please go ahead.
Well, pleasure to be here, but I didn't prepare a SWOT analysis. I'm happy to talk to strengths and weaknesses. However, look, the strength of the relationship is clearly the business relationship. It's people, it's businesses, it's the human embodiment of the business, in the sense that so many top US companies have Indian-born executives. I mean, in the IT world, obviously, with I think it is IBM, Google, and Microsoft, is it, that all have Indian-born CEOs? It's just the relationship is embodied in those business leaders who, of course, know India very well, but also know the US very well, and they live in both worlds, and of course they unite the two countries. So the strength is that those personal business ties between the US and India, and that's now paying off in terms of US investments in India and US business with India, which is growing very rapidly after a long period of stagnation. The weakness, however, is the ignorance in the United States of India. People simply don't know much about India in the United States. The name recognition of Mr. Narendra Modi has only just passed 50% in the United States. But even more concerning than the low awareness of ordinary Americans is the very poor knowledge of America's strategic elite of India or Indian history, Indian affairs. They just know very little about the country. They've taken for granted some often repeated myths about India that simply aren't true, but nonetheless, through endless repetition, they've become established. So that India is no longer a democracy, that India's human rights have been backsliding, that India does not respect the rights of minorities, that India somehow supports authoritarian regimes like those in Russia and Iran. These are all patently false, but only patently so for those who open their eyes and take a close look. For people who just repeat what they've heard second or third hand about India, well, it's not so obvious. And I think if I can just go on to give one example of that, when Barack Obama notoriously said 2 months ago that India, if it didn't solve its human rights problems, it might face a second partition. That was not the well-informed analysis of a global leader. That was the ignorant repetition of things he had heard from advisors who had read it in the Washington Post. And that's really where we sit with US knowledge of India. It's really at that low a level.
Thank you, Salvatore, talking about ignorance. So I have this clip. You know, John Foster Dulles is on record. He was former Secretary of State.
Right.
So this is an exchange between John Foster Dulles and a journalist by name Walter Lippmann.
Mm-hmm.
So this has been cited. In those days, the Americans' understanding of India was extremely limited. To take an extreme example, John Foster Dulles, President Dwight Eisenhower's Secretary of State, had to be disabused by Walter Lippmann during a conversation on Seattle as late as 1955 that Gurkha troops were not Pakistanis. Look, Walter, Dulles said, I've got to get some real fighting men in South of Asia. The only Asians who can really fight are Pakistanis. That's why we need them in the alliance. We could never get along without the Gurkhas. But faster, Lippmann replied, the Gurkhas are not Pakistanis, they are Indians. Actually, Gurkhas are Nepalese.
Yeah.
Well, responded Dulles, they may not be Pakistanis, but they are Muslims. No, I'm afraid they are not Muslims either. They are Hindus, Lippmann pointed out. So, talking about ignorance, I think that has been the hallmark of US India relationship, uh, you know, from 1947 onwards.
Yeah.
And part of it is that United States likes to subcontract certain, activities. So Indian subcontinent, the policy decisions and expertise was kind of, you know, subcontracted to UK. US did not have domain expertise on India, Indian culture. And I think you are talking about the same thing. So there's definitely a level of ignorance that has not gone away. It still continues.
Mm-hmm.
Any comments?
Oh, absolutely. I have personally heard a recently former US National Security Advisor tell a story about a military coup in India. But of course, there's never been a military coup in India. He must have had some other country in mind. Yet, the story was told to a large audience of think tankers who also didn't pull him up on the fact that there'd never been a military coup in India. So yeah, the level of ignorance is simply profound. I doubt any American could name any politician in India other than Narendra Modi. If they could name a second one, it might be Rahul Gandhi, who they would mistakenly believe was the grandson of Mahatma Gandhi. And that would be the level of knowledge. But this creates serious problems for analysis of India because people will believe anything they hear about India without taking a skeptical eye to it. So when someone tells me, when When a radical intellectual tells me that America is no longer a democracy, it's now a military dictatorship, run in the interests of a tiny capitalist class to export its model militaristically to the rest of the world. Well, I know plenty of academics who would say that. And we all roll our eyes that we've all heard this story before about, the US has become an imperial power. Well, when someone tells you that India is when an academic tells you that India is an authoritarian regime that is just an alternate form of autocracy on a par with China, as the VDEM report, Writers of Democracy Institute report recently did, why would you question it? I mean, if you're an American State Department official, if you're someone who's briefing the president in the United States, why would you doubt statements like this? After all, a prominent intellectual or a prominent institution has made this claim about India. On what basis would you doubt it? You wouldn't doubt it on the basis of your deep personal knowledge of India because you probably don't have that deep personal knowledge. If you go and ask an Indian about it, you're likely to ask a member of the old establishment in India who now feel somewhat disempowered, and they will shake their head and sadly agree with you. All of our analysis of India comes from these kinds of anecdotes. I mean, I'll just make this very concrete, just one time, make it very concrete. I was at the Aspen Security Forum this year in July. Now, this is the big security forum annually for the United States. All the top leaders are there. Antony Blinken was there. Jake Sullivan was there. Condoleezza Rice was chairing the event. There was a China panel. The China panel had 4 top American experts discussing US-China relations. And then there was an India panel immediately following it. That India panel was chaired by a Pakistani American journalist and had 3 Indians on the panel. Not 3 Indian Americans, 3 Indians from India. In other words, they couldn't find a single American expert to sit on that panel. Well, that's a serious problem. If the top US venue for security studies doesn't have a single India expert appearing at that venue, where is our knowledge of India coming from?
I think that has been a problem, and that has been a problem that has afflicted the United States State's Department also. So if you see the bureaucracy, the mandarins in the Foggy Bottom, they were ideologically conditioned to view India as a hostile nation, as a Soviet ally, and that residual thinking still persists. In 80s and 90s, US diplomats were vehemently against India, to mention one, Robin Raphael. They were basically lapping up Pakistani propaganda,
Yeah.
and using megaphones to amplify it and contaminated the process of decision making. Unfortunately, the structure of US government is such that institutions have been created that are still influenced by that kind of ideology. So if you see State Department, it has its own decision-making process, but it has created an institution called USCRIF.
Yeah.
And if you see USCRIF reports, year after year, they keep on criticizing India on human rights, religious freedom, and all. What are their primary sources? They will take one incident, take a biased report from motivated, biased informants. They would never do like, a comprehensive analysis of the incident in a country of 1.4 billion people. And that one incident without any corroboration is magnified into a major, incident, major human right violation. Similarly, this new institution of International Ambassador at Large for Religious Freedom.
Right.
So institutions have been created that feed into State Departments, in ignorance, arrogance, petulance, and paranoia. And that process leads to bilateral mistrust. And I think that is one of the weaknesses. So there's a need for some introspection by United States Department. I must
Right.
say that Pentagon has improved quite a lot. Their bilateral visits between military leaders.
Well, they want to sell equipment to India.
Yes, that is true. That is
That's number one.
definitely true.
Look, I think the situation is worse even than you portray it. So the historical situation, of course, there was that anger at India for being not aligned and for implementing a lot of Soviet-style policies. But that's not the end of it. There also was a lot of inherited British anti-Hinduism that became transferred over into American anti-Hinduism. If you think about a phrase like the quote-unquote Hindu rate of growth, that disparaging that, well, Hindus simply can't somehow manage an economy. Well, China's rate of economic growth up until 1982 was the same as India's, which meaning very, very slow. But no one talked about the Chinese rate of growth, right? There was no sense that it was an ethnic failing of Chinese people that China wasn't growing, but there was for India. I think there's been a broad anti-Hinduism in the British establishment that dates all the way back to the colonial era and to the, certainly evident in the British preference for working with Muslim as opposed to Hindu interlocutors during the pre-partition period, the run-up to independence. But it goes much deeper than that, going all the way back into the colonial era. And it carries forward to today in organizations like the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Now, the USCIRF, for people who may not be that familiar with it, is a semi-independent U.S. government body. It's not part of the State Department, although the State Department has one ambassador at large, as you mentioned, who is ex officio part of the commission. But most of its work has been driven by the desire of Christian evangelists to work in countries overseas. So when Christian evangelists want access to a country, they can make complaints to USCIRF, which then gets amalgamated into a major report that comes out every year on international religious freedom. So, for example, if you look at the India report, there will be over 800 incidences of supposed hate crimes against Christians in India versus fewer than a dozen allegations of hate crimes against Muslims. Now, whatever you may think of the status of Muslims in India, and we can get into that if you want, the idea that Christians face discrimination at a level 80 times Muslims is patently ridiculous. I mean, Muslims do face social exclusion in India. There is some low level of anti-Muslim discrimination in India. It's a relatively low level, I believe, and we have lots of data on that we could talk about in a different context. But the idea that Christians are 80 times more discriminated against than Muslims is patently ridiculous. But the reason why it's there is that if you are a Christian missionary and you want to exert pressure on the Indian government, where do you go? You go to the US State Department. If you're an Indian Muslim and you want to exert external pressure on the Indian government, where do you go? You're much more likely to go to the Gulf, to go to friendly Gulf Arab states, which then might exert pressure back on the Indian government. The irony, however, is that when the USCIRF report is written up in the last few years, each time it's been written, it explicitly says India faces severe allegations of religious hatred targeting Muslims. Okay, which is ridiculous because the report is 80-1 reports against Christians. Now, when you look a little deeper, you see who is President Biden's ambassador at large for international religious freedom. I know nothing else about him except that his name is Rashad Hussain. Now, I'm just going to go out on a limb and assume that Rashad Hussain is a Muslim name. I know nothing about the man. I have nothing against him. But I do know that Muslim American associations, and these are AstroTurf associated, these are not grassroots Muslim organizations in the US. These are Muslim Brotherhood funded, Gulf Arab funded organizations in the US, strongly lobby the US to get certain policies. Now, when a Jewish American organization lobbies, what they want is a Holocaust Remembrance Day, or they want funds for the Holocaust Museum. When a Muslim American association lobbies, what they want is positions that can be used to stigmatize Israel and or India. And so what these positions, ambassador at large is not a diplomatic role. It's a political appointment. The only role that this man has is to put his signature on the International Religious Freedom Report. Fundamentally, he doesn't do anything else. And the Muslim lobby, again, I want to always emphasize, not American Muslims. These are not grassroots level efforts. These are a lobby of international Islamists funded by the Gulf, funded by the Muslim Brotherhood. These organizations wanted their man at the State Department, and when Biden came to office, they got their man. So whereas before 2021, India was being attacked by Christian missionaries who wanted greater access to the Indian market for souls, so to speak. Now India is being attacked by Islamists, who want to stigmatize the Indian government, and that's just how American politics work. So the USCIRF is fundamentally there to exert pressure on foreign governments on behalf of U.S. interest groups, and this is what it's doing against India.
So coming back to weaknesses, historically, United States has used sanctions as a means of instrument of foreign policy.
Yes.
And historically, India had been the most sanctioned country by United States for various reasons. Now, it is, over a period of last 20 years, those sanctions have been gradually lifted.
Right.
But this has left an environment of mistrust, because to build confidence, you really have to go a mile forward so that the past rancor, past bitterness does not afflict the bilateral relationship. Do you have any advice to US administration about how to move forward from those regime of sanctions against India?
I think the bilateral relationship is going to be fine. The bilateral relationship is driven by interests, and the U.S. will continue to do business with India. I mean, notice that when Prime Minister Modi was in Washington, President Biden, the I think the Senate Majority Leader, the Speaker of the House, the Secretary of the Treasury, National Security Advisor, all had the same message, which was, India's human rights problems are India's business, and we will engage with them quietly, because that was the message India wanted. Now, frankly, I think that was a big mistake for India, because none of them said, actually, India doesn't have serious human rights problems. None of them came out and defended India, because they weren't asked to defend India. They were asked, just say it's India's own business and it's none of our business, because India's position on this is that national sovereignty trumps international human rights concerns. Now, I think that's a strategic mistake on India's part, but nonetheless, the U.S. has accepted this narrative from India in its relations with India. And of course, India is happy to cooperate with the United States in order to get access to technology. So right now, the relationship is highly transactional. And I think that, that's fitting the needs of both parties, which is to say, from a broad strategic standpoint, India doesn't really need the US. The US doesn't really need India. It's not like a situation between the US and Europe, where Europe is, as the Ukraine war has shown, highly dependent on the United States for its own security. India will take care of its own security. So I really don't see there being a problem in the relationship. I just see it being much shallower than it should or could be.
I think you've very well said that it is much shallower than it should have been or it could be. So the potential is there.
Yeah, of course.
If we see last 2 decades, the relationship has improved tremendously.
Yeah.
From the low point of Bill Clinton sanctions over Pokhran 2 nuclear explosions, that was a low point. But since then, the relationship has tremendously improved, despite of which party is in power in US and in India. The relationships have improved successively over year after year. Yes, there are some nuances. The lowest point in bilateral relationship was in 1971 during Nixon-Kissinger administration. And of course, there are records of their view of India as well as their view of India's leader at that time, Indira Gandhi. But generally, the impression has been that whenever there's a democratic administration, they tend to have, harm the interests of bilateral relationship. And Republican administrations, from the mistakes they committed in the early part, have become wiser. They are more, mature in understanding the nuances of bilateral relationship. So during Barack Obama's time, there was this incident, diplomatic incident, in which an Indian diplomat was arrested in New York by an overzealous prosecutor from Democratic Party who wanted to, further his political interests. However, the administration was not able to set aside the limits, saying that diplomatic immunity is diplomatic immunity. So in the beginning of Biden administration, we saw the same tendency of, disparaging US-India relationship or India in general. So the impression is that the relationship flourishes under Republican administrations and sometimes nosedives under Democratic administration. As an American citizen, what is your viewpoint about that?
Let's remember that 65 members of Congress walked out of Mr. Modi's speech to the joint session of Congress, and all 65 were Democrats. The Democratic Party is closely aligned with the NGO, the non-governmental organization world, and with the human rights NGO world. Those organizations have, in many cases, been captured by Islamists. Where they're not captured by Islamists, they're staffed by, I think, idealists who have very little knowledge of what actually goes on the ground. That is, they hear a call from somebody saying, please free my people. And they think, wow, whoever's oppressing those people must be terrible. And so they hear a call from Khalistan and they think, oh, Khalistan must be a just cause, and those who are preventing it are oppressors. They hear a call from Kashmiri separatists, and again, they're sympathetic to these calls. They hear calls from separatists in the northeast of India, from Maoists, and again, they think anyone who's stopping this must be oppressive. And it's misplaced idealism combined with actual targeting by Islamist organizations to insert people into human rights organizations, a lot of that tied to the Palestinian struggle. And so tied to the conflict over Israel. So this human rights industry, if you will, the human rights ecosystem is much more closely tied to the Democratic Party than to the Republican Party. And they want to essentially pry India away from the US. And I think as long as the relationship is purely transactional, purely based on sovereign interests, there's always the risk that when a Democratic administration comes in, that very radical wing of the Democratic Party will attempt to pry it away from support for India because there's not a broad-based values-driven engagement with India. Now, what I would like to see is the United States recognizing that India is not only a fellow democracy, it's the only successful democracy in the developing world. India should be absolutely central to U.S. efforts to promote democracy in Southeast Asia, in the Middle East, in Sub-Saharan Africa, because India has shown that it's possible to run a robust liberal democracy in a poor country. But if Americans don't believe that India is a real democracy, they're never going to promote that narrative. On top of that, the Indian government, and I mean Indian governments of both parties, have done themselves no favors by holding to this, I'm going to be very frank, Chinese/Russian model of national sovereignty, of absolute national sovereignty, which I understand the reasons for it in India, but it effectively seeds the ground. It effectively tells Americans, well, we're not going to deny our accusations of human rights violations against us because we're sovereign and it's none of your business to ask. Well, that's what Russia says. That's what China says. I would like to see an Indian government be flexible enough to say, yeah, come have a look, because India really is a democracy that really does respect human rights. India has nothing to hide, and build an actual alliance of values to replace this simple confluence of interests. But that's my own hope for the future and a hope for, frankly, for a more peaceful world. India is not asking for that. And in a time when the Indian government is not asking for that, you can't very well blame the US government for not giving it.
So talking about ignorance, you cited the example of Barack Obama giving an interview to, CNN, Amanpour, in which he sort of, criticized India's human rights record. Now, generally, the adage in United States is that there is only one president at a time, and only the president speaks. Other presidents, out of respect for protocol, do not make major announcements in foreign policy arena. This was a serious departure from that convention. And it's a time-honored convention in United States domestic politics that there is one president at a time. You may have been president in the past 8 years, but at this point in time, Joe Biden is the president. So you have any comments, not just about the ignorance, but about the breach of protocol by Barack Obama?
So first, I want to dispel any notion that I've seen a lot of this in Indian analysis of Obama's comments. I want to dispel any notion that Barack Obama was acting as the mouthpiece of the Biden administration. That's simply not the case. Biden and Obama have never been on good terms. Barack Obama has shown nothing but contempt for Biden and the Biden administration. He won't say anything positively to show that, but it's very clear that he is not willing to be a tool of Biden foreign policy. So I think Obama's comments were his genuine thoughts on the matter. As for the U.S. only having one president at a time, I think that broke down during the Trump administration. And really, during the Trump administration, all bets were off. Nobody in the American political establishment was willing to cede the ground to Donald Trump and say, we'll all unite behind our president. That just didn't happen during the Trump administration. And so I'm not surprised that norm is now pretty much broken down. Norms don't last forever. You're absolutely right that was the norm up until 2016. I don't think it's the norm anymore.
Okay. I think you are right there. Now, talking about strengths, one of the pillars of strength in US-India relationship is the Indian diaspora. And with all its faults and flaws, Indian diaspora has furthered the cause of advancement of US-India relationship. It has changed certain perceptions that India is a land of snake charmers and, sort of elephants and, cows roaming around on the roads, to highly confident, professional, scientist, technological background, intellectually competent. And that diaspora is, furthering the cause year by year. There might be some mistakes here and there, but we don't have a counterpart there. We have Indian students coming to US universities in very large numbers, but we don't see very many US students coming to Indian universities. Now, to my mind, that has been a flaw. That has been one of the weaknesses because it's lopsided, because United States academics and students don't see a face of vibrant India, and they rely on motivated accounts from biased individuals who have their own axe to grind. So how we can, change this situation by which US academics like you have been visiting India, but there are very few who will go to India actually and do field research. They just rely on opinions, third-rate opinions, passed down by multiple people.
The lack of travel in the other direction from the US to India is a real shame. It's unfortunate, especially considering that obviously you can travel all around India speaking only English, which is something that, for example, you can't do in China. So there have been I mean, obviously, the US to China academic flow has been much smaller than the China to US flow, but it's still been very substantial, with many US students going to study for a semester in China, many US academics going to spend a semester teaching in China. It's very common, or at least it was very common up until COVID, up through 2019, despite the fact that you can't use English in China. Now, with India, it should be much, much easier, but there are a few challenges. So first, India does not readily accept the asymmetry of visa regimes. So it's difficult to get a US visa if you are Indian. Okay, it's not as difficult to get an Indian visa if you're American, but you still have to apply for the visa. You can't just travel visa free to India like you can to Thailand, for example. It's not as easy as, for China, you get a 10-year Chinese visa. You never have to think about it again. For India, it's just more cumbersome to get those visas. Similarly, Chinese universities really reached out to US universities for partnerships. In India, that's only recently become possible for Indian state universities to have partners in the US. Now, of course, it's becoming easier, but we're just at the opening phases of this. How many Indian universities will pay over the top? Because remember, hiring an American for one semester on exchange, well, that's the annual salary of 6 Indian professors, just to have the American for one semester. That's going to be a tough financial ask for Indian universities, which of course are run on organizational efficiency grounds versus Chinese universities were and are tools of Chinese foreign policy. So they could do things that were not driven purely by academic prerogatives. And so there are all sorts of things like this, even the fact that it's farther to travel to India than it is to China for Americans. These all make things just that much more difficult. Now, let me bring in the final issue, which is if I want to compare India and China, India is still 15 years behind China in the growth curve. So if I want to compare Americans coming the other way, that is coming to visit India, you'd have to look at China 2007, 2008. Well, there weren't a lot of Americans in China in 2007, 2008. They really started coming in the 2010s in large numbers. So I'm optimistic for this, that India's visa requirements will get easier and easier and smoother, that Indian universities will be better funded, that the partnerships that have only now been made legally possible will start to flourish between US and Indian universities. I think instead of looking backwards and saying, why hasn't this happened? We could look forwards and say, we've only just got to the point in India where this is a viable model to have American visiting students come to Indian universities. And hopefully a few Indian universities will start study abroad programs and start bringing Americans in. I, for example, was a visitor at Banaras Hindu University. That would be an ideal place to bring American visitors. The infrastructure is reasonably good. There are guest house facilities. It's a safe environment. It's a attractive tourist town that has lots of tourist infrastructure for visiting Americans. So if somewhere like BHU were to develop a study abroad program for Americans, I think it could be very successful. And other universities, again, that are located in attractive locations, that are relatively safe, that have good tourist potential, could start attracting American students. But I think now is the time to be thinking about it. You're right to raise the question, because the question is, why don't Indian universities get going with this? The question is not why haven't they? The question is, will they now?
I think they will now because besides state-funded universities, now there is a new growth of privately funded
Of course.
and
Yeah.
corporate sector funded universities in India. And the salary structures are much higher in those universities. So that is as far as college professors are concerned. But ironically, it might be cheaper for US students to study in India.
Yeah.
Much, much
Yeah.
cheaper for US studies students to study in India and got actually at, bachelor's level courses or undergrad courses, top quality education
Yeah.
at a bargain basement discount prices and not, run up hundreds of thousands of dollars in student loans.
But
And
someone someone has to organize it, and I think here we're offering the free business opportunity to someone entrepreneurial, because it won't be American students coming and do their entire bachelor's degrees in India. It'll be students coming for one semester on study abroad to India, and some company, someone very entrepreneurial, probably somebody Indian, is going to negotiate with 4 or 5 universities to set up a consortium to bring over American students to do one semester study abroad in India. It's going to be a great commercial success for them, especially because, as you say, they can they can leverage the difference in tuition, because the U.S. student will be used to paying U.S. tuition and will be willing to pay that amount to study in India, where the costs are much lower. So there's a real arbitrage opportunity, and where the arbitrage exists, the entrepreneurs will follow.
I think that is using the SWOT analysis model. We talked about strengths and weaknesses. Now we are talking about opportunities. So that is definitely an area. And I must say that, a segment of US population does do that. Some of the Indian Americans send their children back home to India to study, not a very large percentage, but a minuscule, because of the advantages there and cultural issues. So at least in arts and humanities, I'm not talking about, medical sciences or whatever, but in arts and humanities, there is a role for Indian universities, Indian schools to provide decent education to US students. So if you want to study Sanskrit or Hindi or, certain aspect of anthropology, rather than rely on secondhand information in United States, you can come to India and study the subject. India was traditionally the center of learning, had large number of universities, Nalanda and Takshila and all, and students used to come from all over the world. So that is an area. The other area where there is an opportunity is medical tourism.
Medical tourism is a difficult industry, and I'm not a specialist on it, but I think you could go beyond the arts and social sciences to consider that American mathematics, science, engineering students could all be studying their subjects again for one semester in India. I don't think the model of getting American students to do degrees in India will ever work, because an Indian degree will not carry the same commercial value on the US job market, and it's just not a likely thing. But to come for a semester, absolutely. Now, medical tourism, I don't know that it's a highly regulated field, and I'm not an expert on that. What I can tell you is that online medical consultations, which are becoming a major industry in themselves, are overwhelmingly done by Indian doctors. So if I want to see a doctor, but I don't need someone to listen to my heart or take my blood pressure, if, for example, I know I have a problem that I want advice with, I want weight loss advice, I'm having trouble with allergies, and I'd like advice on allergies. These are the sorts of things. Even I could get the testing done here in Australia, or get the testing done in a lab in the US, because generally testing doesn't, well, in Australia it does, but in the US you can get testing without a prescription, right? You simply, if you want the test, you can get it. And then you can have your test results interpreted by an Indian doctor. So telemedicine, as opposed to medical tourism, I suspect is going to be a real opportunity for trade. But again, medicine's a highly regulated area, and it's not my area of specialization.
It's highly regulated in both the countries, but
Yeah,
certain things are happening. But again, as far as we are looking for opportunities, that is definitely one area where informal, not state supported, but informal, exchange, economic exchange will definitely be helpful. Again, talking about opportunities, President Biden invited Prime Minister Modi as a guest of the host
right.
for the APEC meeting in San Francisco in November 2023. As you know, that APEC is not a mechanism of countries, it is a mechanism of participating economies. Historically, India was denied a seat on APEC for various reasons, and the two countries that actually vehemently opposed India's inclusion in APEC were China and United States.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't this an opportunity for President Biden not just to invite Prime Minister Modi as a guest of the host, but basically to be inducted, to induct India as a participating economy as part of the APEC process? Any comments?
Honestly, I don't follow APEC, and I was even unaware that Mr. Modi had been invited to APEC. I think of much greater importance is that India has consistently, for the last several years, been invited to the G7 meetings, and I don't think the G7 makes sense without India at this point. Now it's not a G7 at this point because the G7 and the European Union is there, so it's already a G8. But I think it's almost certainly going to become a G9 in the sense that the whole point of the G7 is that it is the group of the world's largest democratic economies. Now, with India being the fifth largest economy in the world, soon to be the third largest economy in the world, soon to be the second largest democratic economy in the world, India has to be at the G7, and it is at the G7 in all but name, right? So it's a regular guest visitor, and I think the G7 is far more important for economic governance in the world and setting economic governance standards than APEC. Frankly, I think APEC is an empty shell of an organization, which is why I don't follow it. Like I said, I wasn't even aware that the meeting was coming up in November.
So I think you already spoke about my next point, that APEC is constrained because of presence of China's and
Yeah,
China's veto. G7 is not constrained.
yeah,
If the US as leader of G7 decides that we need to enlarge G7 mechanisms to make it de facto and de jure G8 mechanism, you don't have this, fig leaf of China that China will
yeah,
object.
yeah, yeah.
You could do it. It is a sincere and a serious opportunity for bilateral relationship enhancement, and it does require vision not part of India, but vision and part of United States.
Yeah.
Similarly, I know US has been working about India's membership in NSG, which has again been hamstrung by China. But what do you think about possibility? And I'm raising this as a possibility about enlarging the AUKUS and including India as part of the AUKUS technology transfer mechanism.
Yeah. I'm just going to say flat out, India is not going to be invited to join AUKUS.
I know that.
And that's just
I know that.
a
But
flat
what
like
about it?
it's not going to happen. And frankly, it shouldn't happen because it's not the purpose of AUKUS is that it's a group of countries that are together tracking all of the Chinese and Russian nuclear missile submarines. That is, at any point in time, the U.S. wants to know where every single Russian and Chinese ballistic missile submarine is, just in case of the ultimate catastrophe of moving towards a nuclear war. Australia is joining that because increasingly the focus of that U.S.-UK alliance and that U.S.-UK cooperation has been going on ever since the end of World War II. It's been a continuous process. Well, increasingly that is shifting to the Pacific, and frankly, there are no appropriate bases, especially Indian Ocean bases for submarines. And the obvious place to base nuclear submarines in the Pacific was, or I'm sorry, in the Indian Ocean was Australia. And so Australia is joining that grouping because of its such like extraordinarily close historical ties with both the US and UK. AUKUS is now the tightest alliance group in the world. It's not an alliance in the formal sense, but in practical terms, it is the tightest grouping. There is tighter than NATO, tighter than Five Eyes. It is, the Australia has been invited into the US UK Nuclear Watchdog Club. Um, India doesn't belong in that club. I don't mean any offense to India or Indians. India is always going to be non-aligned. India is always going to pursue its own national interest. India is never going to be an unshakable member of a US UK ordered world. India will always be presenting an alternative version of economic governance, an alternative version of democracy, not being part of this Anglo-Saxon alliance. So I don't see a place for India in it. There's nothing wrong with that. That's not an insult to India. It's simply not what India does in the world.
So I'm glad that you use that word Anglo-Saxon alliance India is very wary of Anglo-Saxon alliance because India was a colony of an Anglo-Saxon power for
Sure.
200 years. So, once bitten, twice shy. And the way India became colonized was through trade route.
Yeah.
But, the point I'm trying to make is that AUKUS is not just monitoring the nuclear submarines, it is technology transfer about building nuclear powered submarines. And
Yeah,
the
but
reason, let
yeah.
me
Go
finish
on. Sorry.
just for a
Yeah.
minute.
Yeah.
The reason I'm bringing is that when India leased a nuclear powered submarine, you know, from Russia, there was a lot of heartburn in the United States. And then, you know, Boris Yeltsin, under US pressure, or Bill Clinton's pressure, refused to renew the lease after 10 years and things like that. India has needs for nuclear powered submarines.
Yeah.
Now, if you don't provide that technology to India, India will go to Russia because they are willing to provide the technology. So you are in a no bind, no win situation this way, that you keep it exclusively Anglo-Saxon alliance. If you think of future possibilities, you may do some kind of technology transfer about, small modular reactors, icebreakers, or, nuclear powered aircraft carrier. At least there
Sure.
needs to be some promise of technology transfer. Otherwise, everything is rhetoric to democracies. You need to give concrete deliverables, and time has come for US strategic establishment to open their eyes and see the horizon, what is happening. And I'm not saying, I'm not advocating for India's membership of AUKUS. I use that as a discussion
Yeah.
point to, bring about an issue. And I think unless that change in attitude happens, there will be, shallow level of partnership. That's the point I'm making.
Look, even if the United States and UK wanted that kind of partnership with India, there are no signs that India wants that kind of partnership with the US and UK. AUKUS is not about selling nuclear submarines to Australia. AUKUS is about Australia taking up part of the responsibility alongside the US and UK for doing this monitoring. And it's not just about the nuclear reactors, it's about the entire suite of technologies for countering nuclear ballistic missile subs with nuclear attack subs. India is not going to join Team America for doing this. India is going to have its own foreign policy. So if India wanted simply to buy a nuclear reactor for submarines, yes, it's conceivable that the US would sell nuclear reactor technology to India. That would not bring India into AUKUS because Australia is not buying a nuclear reactor from the US. Australia is buying entire nuclear attack submarine technology from the US and UK. Now, India has access to nuclear technology for submarines, not only from Russia, but also from France. India can buy this in the market. Nuclear reactor technology for submarines is not so rare in the world these days that, again, I'm not a specialist on nuclear reactors, but India can get this through other means. And my strong impression of Indian foreign policy priorities is that India does not have a desire to join the Western alliance. India seems to want to have an independent foreign policy in which it looks out only for Indian interests. And I stress this, in India's own home region. India has never shown any signs of wanting to send forces to Africa to engage in stability operations there or trying to fight China in the South China Sea. India's defense posture has always been number one, to protect India, and number two, to promote stability in neighboring countries like Bangladesh, like Sri Lanka, more broadly, like Myanmar, and I even suspect someday in Pakistan. That is, if I were to look for 5, 10 years down the road, if there were serious problems in Pakistan, who would people in Pakistan turn to for help with stability? Believe it or not, I'm going to guess it's going to be India. But India is not going to join a global cat and mouse game of nuclear brinksmanship with the US, UK, and Australia. It's not part of the club, and it doesn't want to be part of the club. So,
I think you
why
have very
be
well
petulant
said.
about it?
You have very well said, and actually, I cannot agree with more on this summation of India's foreign policy posture, because I do agree with that. That's the reality. But I was just making a point about selective transfer of critical technologies, and then sort of, complaining that India goes to Russia for certain technologies.
Well,
That's
the
what I
US is
want to.
shopping the F-35 fighter to India. India can't afford it, but clearly the US is expressing a desire to sell F-35s to India by bringing the fighter to the Bangalore Air Show. Um, there doesn't seem to be any reluctance on the part of the United States, either under the Trump administration or under the Biden administration. There doesn't seem to be any reluctance to selling top US technology to India. But that's different from AUKUS. AUKUS is not about the submarines. AUKUS is about the operation of the submarines.
Coming to the last part of the SWOT analysis, threats.
Mhm.
So what are the threats you see or perceive in future about bilateral India-US relationship?
The real threat is the human rights card. It's that anti-India forces will play the human rights card to convince a U.S. administration, likely a Democratic Party administration, to place sanctions on India, to be unwilling to sell equipment to India. That is the real threat. Is that the American political consensus today is that India has a terrible human rights record, but it's too big a market to ignore, and it's balancing China. So it's better. It's bad, but not as bad as China. Now, that's completely wrong. I mean, I don't see any hard evidence of any kinds of human rights violations in India on anything like the scale that has been sold. In fact, I view India's treatment of human rights to be roughly on a par with those of the United States. Maybe not as good as some European countries, maybe not as good as Australia's, but on a par with the United States. That is well within democratic norms. Um, but that doesn't stop this myth from being a reality. It doesn't stop this myth from spreading. This is simply what the American political establishment believes about India. And if you don't believe me on that, read the New York Times, read the Washington Post, and then read the Wall Street Journal. And the Wall Street Journal will not contradict them. It simply will say, well, yes, we admit there are problems, but we still should deal with India. This is the biggest threat, that it goes from there are serious problems, but we'll still deal with India, to, you know what, India is an unsavory regime and we can't do business there.
So,
And
Salvatore, it
that's a real
reminds me
threat.
of Nazi Germany's propaganda minister, Dr. Goebbels. You tell a lie 1,000
Yeah.
times, it becomes the truth. And the US establishment, under influence a leftist ecosystem, does not realize that they have perpetuated myths. You talked about New York Times. I remember in, I think, early 80s, there was a New York Times India correspondent, Barbara Crosset, who would write about India being a rogue democracy.
Mhm.
So that mantra has been chanted by US establishment, and it needs to disabuse itself, the US establishment, from this mantra and shed anti-India hostility. That's in interest of both the countries. That's in the interest of democracy, human rights, universal values. And I think it'll be good for the entire world if we stop looking at India with tinted glasses. It's been a pleasure, Salvatore, to have on this platform of Council for Strategic Affairs. We are glad that finally we connected, and I hope that you will continue to come on our platform in various events. It was pleasure to have you. I know how busy you are. Thank you very much indeed for this conversation. And
Pleasure to talk to you.
I hope that we'll take these threads further in the cause of enhancing the bilateral relationship. Thank you to our distinguished guest, Professor Salvatore Babones. We are pleased to have you.